The war had ended, but peace was only pretending. By 1952, the world had drawn its lines again, not with trenches and tanks, but with silence and suspicion. The Cold War had begun, invisible but everywhere, a battle fought in shadows, in whispers, and sometimes in places no one expected. The city of Helsinki stood at the edge of two worlds. To the west, freedom. To the east, the Iron Curtain. And in that summer of 1952, the Olympic flame rose above the Finnish sky, a symbol of unity in a time when the world had none. For 12 days, athletes from nations that no longer trusted each other gathered to compete under the same flag of peace. Cameras smiled, politicians shook hands, and the crowd cheered. But beneath the sound of applause, something else moved, quiet, precise, and deadly. His name was Mikhail Voronov. At least that's what his passport said. Officially, he was a marksman, one of the Soviet Union's finest shooters, a decorated veteran of the Great Patriotic War. To his teammates, he was a man of few words, cold and methodical, with the kind of focus only soldiers understood. But behind the stoicism lay another life, one he had never chosen but could never escape. Mikhail wasn't just competing. He was on assignment. Somewhere among the Western delegations, intelligence claimed, was a defector, a man who had once been part of the Soviet intelligence network in occupied Europe, now hiding under a false name with the Americans. The Kremlin wanted him silenced. The message was clear: you will travel to Helsinki. You will compete. And when the time comes, you will complete your mission. No medals. No glory. Just a bullet. He arrived in Finland with the other athletes, the uniforms crisp, the faces expressionless. The crowd cheered as the Soviet team marched into the stadium, red flags waving like a new dawn. But Mikhail's eyes scanned the stands, not the sky. Somewhere out there was his target. The man's name was whispered only once: Anders Keller, a former OSS operative who had vanished after the war. The Americans claimed he was dead. Moscow knew otherwise. Anders was believed to be living under a new identity, part of a Western press crew covering the Olympics. If he spoke, if he revealed what he knew about Soviet operations in post-war Europe, entire networks would crumble. Thousands of agents could be exposed. Mikhail had been chosen not for his skill, but for his reliability. He followed orders. He didn't miss. But the thing about perfect shooters is that they remember every face they've seen through a scope. And sometimes faces come back. The first week passed quietly. Mikhail trained with the others, shooting at paper silhouettes under the calm Finnish sun. The crowd admired his precision. A machine, one journalist said. No hesitation. No mercy. At night, he walked alone through the quiet streets of Helsinki, a city still rebuilding from the last war, filled with scars that hadn't yet healed. The air smelled of iron and rain. Everywhere he looked, he saw ghosts. Men in uniforms. Women waiting. Children chasing nothing. He found himself wondering if this was what peace looked like. A place where people smiled but still flinched at every echo. On the third day he received his signal. A folded note slipped under his door. No signature. Just 2 words and a time. Tomorrow. Noon. The next day Mikhail left the Olympic Village before dawn. He carried his rifle case like any athlete would. No one stopped him. At the edge of the city, in a small training range reserved for press demonstrations, he found the man. Anders Keller. Older now, thinner. His hair had gone gray. He was wearing a civilian jacket, standing near a group of Western reporters, laughing softly. When Mikhail saw him, something inside him froze, not fear but recognition. Because this wasn't a stranger. This was the man who had once saved his life. It was 1944 in the ruins of Warsaw. Mikhail had been pinned under rubble, his unit decimated, a German patrol closing in. He remembered the boots, the shouting, and then, silence. A hand pulling him from the debris. A man with foreign insignia. American. They didn't speak the same language, but they understood the same truth. War was ending and men like them were just tired of killing. The American had pointed him east and vanished. Mikhail never saw him again. Until now. Anders Keller. The man he owed his life to. The man he was now ordered to kill. He stayed still for a long time, hidden behind the edge of the bleachers. The crowd's laughter sounded distant, unreal. His hands didn't shake, but his breath did. He opened the rifle case. Assembled it piece by piece. The same motion he had done 1,000 times before. And then he looked through the scope. The world shrank into a circle. Just the target, the trigger, and the weight of everything between them. He remembered the faces of the men he'd killed. None had looked back. But this one might. The crowd began to clap. A nearby athlete hit the bullseye. Mikhail's finger hovered over the trigger. He could end it now. A single breath. A single pull. A single ghost less in the world. But then he saw something in Anders' eyes, a kind of peace Mikhail had never known. A man who had survived war and chosen not to carry it anymore. He exhaled. Slowly. Quietly. And then, instead of the shot that would have started another war, he aimed at the sky. The rifle cracked. The crowd gasped. A bird fell from the clouds. Applause erupted. The perfect shot, they thought. Anders looked around, puzzled, unaware of what almost happened. Mikhail lowered the rifle, his heartbeat steady. The mission was over. But not as they had planned. He turned, handed the rifle to his coach and walked away. No one stopped him. No one knew what he had just refused to do. That night, he sat alone in his room, the air heavy with smoke and silence. Outside, fireworks burst over the stadium. The crowd celebrated another victory, another medal, another moment of glory. But Mikhail didn't watch. He opened his hands and looked at his fingers, the same fingers that had ended lives, that had built this moment of mercy. For the first time in years they were trembling. He would not return to Moscow. He knew what awaited him there. To disobey was death. But as the fireworks lit the sky, he realized something profound. For the first time since the war, he had made a choice that was his. He had aimed true, not at a man but at his own silence. He stayed up until dawn, watching the light crawl across the ceiling of the small apartment the Soviet delegation had been given. Outside, the city still echoed with the laughter of spectators and the shuffle of street sweepers clearing confetti from the pavement. Inside, Mikhail sat at the desk with a single envelope in front of him. He had known what would happen the moment he chose not to pull the trigger. Orders ignored were not forgiven. Loyalty was not a thing that bent. But there was a kind of calm that came with inevitability. He took a sheet of paper from the drawer, wrote a note that said nothing and everything. The shot was fired. The target lives. He folded it, sealed it, and left it on the desk. When he stepped outside, the morning air was clean and cool, the smell of wet stone and pine. The sun was low, spilling gold across the rooftops. He walked through the quiet streets, past bakeries opening for the day, past the river where the reflection of the Olympic Stadium shimmered. For a moment he imagined what it must look like from above. The circles of the Olympic rings, unbroken, endless. He found himself at the edge of the training grounds where the shooters practiced. The range was empty now. Targets hung torn and ragged from the previous day's competition. He picked up one, ran his fingers over the bullet holes and smiled faintly. He had never thought much about what shooting meant until he decided not to. In the distance he heard footsteps. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Comrade Voronov," a voice said quietly. "You did not report for debrief." Mikhail turned slowly. The man was short, compact, wearing civilian clothes. His expression was polite, almost sympathetic. That was how the secret police always looked before they killed you. "I'm here," Mikhail said. The man nodded. "You had one task. The committee is disappointed." Mikhail looked back at the targets. "The task was completed," he said. "The target is alive." The message was sent. The man's jaw tightened. "You think this is a game?" Mikhail met his gaze. "It's the only one worth playing." For a long moment, neither moved. Then the man sighed, slipped a small folded paper from his coat and dropped it on the ground. "You should leave Finland before the week ends," he said. "You won't be on the flight home." He turned and walked away, his footsteps soft against the gravel. Mikhail watched him go, then looked down. The paper was blank on one side, but on the back, in faint pencil, were two words: "Go north." He looked up toward the horizon. Beyond the forests, the Lapland mountains rose like ghosts against the sky. He left the Olympic village that night. No one noticed, no one asked. The games continued, races run, medals won, the world pretending peace again. Mikhail boarded a train headed north, away from the city and everything that had defined him. The car smelled of coal and snow. Passengers slept, their heads against the windows, their dreams lit by the reflection of the passing flame. He stared at his hands. For the first time he thought of them not as weapons but as instruments. They could build, they could hold, they could steady. When he reached the border, he stepped off the train and walked into the forest. There were no guards this far out, no fences. Only trees and the endless hush of snow. He walked until he found a cabin, abandoned, its door half open. Inside there was a wood stove, a few books, a map of Finland pinned to the wall. He built a fire and sat on the floor, letting the warmth seep into his bones. That night he dreamed of the war. The sound of rifles, the smell of smoke, the faces of men who had never stopped fighting even after peace had been declared. But this time in the dream he laid the rifle down and walked away. When he woke it was snowing. He stepped outside, the forest silent around him. Somewhere far away, church bells rang from a village he would never see. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes and whispered to no one, "It's over." Years passed. The Cold War deepened, the world moved on. Helsinki's games faded into history, remembered for their triumphs, not their secrets. And Mikhail Voronov disappeared, officially declared missing in action, another name swallowed by the machinery of history. But in a small town in northern Finland there were stories. Of a quiet Russian man who worked as a carpenter, who spoke little, who went to church on Sundays but always sat in the back. They said he had the steady hands of a marksman, that he could fix anything made of wood or metal. He lived simply, without visitors, without past. Sometimes on winter nights when the aurora lit the sky, he would walk out to the frozen lake and fire one shot into the air. Not in anger. Not in memory. Just to hear the echo fade into silence. He never missed. In 1980, long after his name had been erased from Soviet records, the Olympics came to Moscow. A journalist from Finland, researching the forgotten games of '52, came across an old photo. A Soviet marksman, expression unreadable, standing in front of a target board. The caption simply read, "Voronov, USSR." The journalist went north, following rumors. He found the cabin, empty but neat. On the wall hung a map of Finland, the route from Helsinki marked with a single line ending in the mountains. Beside it, an old rifle leaned against the window, oiled and clean, a single bullet missing from its case. On the table was a note, written in Russian and translated years later. "The world is full of men who never miss. But only once did I aim for something worth missing." The journalist left the cabin as he found it. He didn't publish the story. He didn't tell anyone. Some truths, he decided, work better as whispers. At every Olympic shooting range since, the silence between each shot seems a little longer, the air a little heavier. And when the crowd claps for the perfect mark, the echo that follows sounds almost like a heartbeat. No one remembers Mikhail Voronov. But somewhere in the long shadow between war and peace, his shot still rings. The shot that never missed. In the years that followed, the world shifted again and again, as if history itself could never find balance. Nations rose, borders hardened, and technology replaced faith with information. Yet, in the smallest corners of that vast, trembling world, the story of the Soviet marksman lingered, passed from voice to voice like an old legend told in smoke-filled bars and over cracked radios. In Leningrad, an aging officer once whispered it to a new recruit. "There was a shooter," he said, "who chose not to shoot. The party called him a traitor. I call him a man." The recruit laughed, not believing it, but years later, when he stood on a border post staring at a foreign face through a rifle scope, he remembered that story, and hesitated. That was the quiet legacy Mikhail left behind. No medals. No monuments. Just hesitation, the kind that saves lives instead of ending them. The cabin where he had lived fell to time. The roof sagged, the stove rusted, and the forest began to reclaim it. Yet, inside, everything remained strangely untouched. The rifle still leaned by the window. The map still hung, the ink faded but unbroken. On the table, beside the note, lay a single coin, a finished marca polished by years of turning between fingers. Some say it was a keepsake. Others say it was payment to fate for letting him walk away. In 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, an archivist in Moscow was tasked with cataloging old KGB files. Among the dust and decay, he found a folder marked simply Voronov Am. Inside were half-burned documents, mission orders, photos from Helsinki, and a single stamped note from 1953. Subject presumed dead. Case closed. But at the bottom of the file was something else. A letter. It had never been sent. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the ink almost gone. To whoever finds this, I was not loyal to the state. I was loyal to the silence that followed my choice. The world speaks too loudly of victory. Someone must remember mercy. The archivist read it twice, then closed the folder. He didn't file it. He didn't destroy it. He just slipped it into his coat and took it home. Because some stories don't belong to governments. They belong to people. Years later, the story reached the ears of a historian working on a documentary about the Helsinki Games. She searched for proof, military records, photographs, anything. There were none. Only rumors, fragments, and that one note the Finnish journalist had found decades earlier. Still, she felt the truth in it. She said it was like trying to catch smoke. You could see it move, feel its shape, but never hold it. And yet, the more she searched, the more it revealed something deeper. The games weren't just a stage for athletes. They were mirrors showing what the world wanted to believe about itself, and what it feared it still was. She decided to end her film not with medals or victories, but with silence. The screen went black, and then came the sound of a single shot, echoing across decades. No target. No applause. Just the sound of a man choosing peace. In 2008, long after the Cold War had faded into memory, a group of construction workers clearing land near the Finnish border uncovered a metal box buried in the frost. Inside were papers wrapped in oilcloth, old, delicate, nearly destroyed by time. One was a letter written in Russian, signed only MV. To the games that gave me one last battlefield. I hope I left it better than I found it. If the world must keep competing, let it be only to see who can endure peace the longest. The papers were turned over to a museum, though few knew what to make of them. Some said they were forgeries, others said they were the missing chapter of an unwritten history. But when the museum opened a new exhibit on the Helsinki Olympics, they placed the letter in a small glass case beside an empty display labeled Unknown Athlete. Visitors passed it without stopping. A few read the words. Fewer understood them. But every now and then someone would linger, maybe a soldier, maybe a runner, maybe just a person tired of noise, and they'd read the final line aloud, softly, as if testing its weight. There are wars that end with silence, and men who find peace in a single shot. And for a moment they'd feel it, the stillness that follows courage. Decades later, on an Olympic shooting range far from Finland, a young competitor stepped onto the line. She was Russian-born but trained in the West, the daughter of two histories that no longer fought but never fully trusted each other. As she raised her rifle, her coach, an old Finn with kind eyes, leaned in and said quietly, "There was once a man who missed on purpose. Remember him when you aim." She smiled, not understanding, but when she took her shot, something in the air shifted. The bullet struck dead center, but what mattered wasn't the sound of the hit, it was the silence that followed. For a heartbeat, it was as if the entire world had inhaled. And somewhere, across time and shadow, a man who had long since vanished smiled in the snow. He had missed once. Perfectly. And in that silence, the world seemed to pause, just for a heartbeat, as if the past itself had stopped to listen. The crowd erupted seconds later, a wave of applause sweeping across the range. Cameras flashed. Broadcasters shouted in half a dozen languages. The young shooter lowered her rifle and exhaled, the way her coach had taught her. She didn't know why the air around her felt so heavy, so reverent, only that she sensed something far larger than herself lingering in that echo. That night after the ceremony, she sat alone in the athletes' village, scrolling through photos of her win. In one of the pictures taken just as she fired, a strange flicker of light appeared behind her, a brief shimmer, almost like snow. She thought it was just the flash of another camera, But the old coach, when he saw it, only nodded. Sometimes, he said, the past finds a way to witness the present. The story of Mikhail Voronov never appeared in official records. No textbooks mention him, no medals bear his name. And yet, his presence still moves through the veins of the games, subtle as breath. Every time the Olympic torch crosses a border, every time a flag is raised beside another once considered an enemy's, that choice, the decision not to fire, flickers beneath it. Not in documents but in the conscience of the event itself. People like to believe the Olympics are about strength. They forget that sometimes strength means restraint. That was Mikhail's legacy, not the shot he took but the one he refused to. In 2014, a museum curator in Helsinki researching forgotten Cold War artifacts, found herself staring at that old letter again. The paper had yellowed, the ink had faded, but one line still burned clear. If the world must keep competing, let it be only to see who can endure peace the longest. She decided to mount a small exhibit around it, not about the games but about the idea of peace itself. The centerpiece was simple, a replica of an Olympic target, pristine and unmarked, lit by a single lamp. Beneath it a plaque read, "Dedicated to those who aimed for peace." Few people noticed the display. Those who did often left quiet, thoughtful, as if they'd overheard a conversation between time and conscience. Somewhere far from Helsinki, in a remote Finnish village, a snowstorm swept over the mountains one winter night. When the wind eased, locals found the old cabin again, half buried but still standing. Inside the air was cold but dry. On the windowsill lay a coin, the same marca that had once sat beside a letter. It gleamed faintly in the dim light, untouched by rust or time. A boy from the village pocketed it, thinking it a good luck charm. He would grow up to be a soldier, then later, a teacher. And on a quiet afternoon decades later, when asked why he taught history instead of fighting in another war, he smiled and said, "Because sometimes the world needs reminders of when someone didn't pull the trigger." History never wrote Mikhail's name, but it carried his echo. It appeared in small gestures, in soldiers lowering their rifles before the order, in diplomats shaking hands when they didn't have to, in athletes who stepped forward to help a rival stand. Tiny, invisible mercies that kept the world from tipping into madness. The Cold War ended not with a bang but with exhaustion, the same exhaustion Mikhail had felt in his bones when he turned his rifle to the sky. The world finally realized that endless conflict could not define it forever. Somewhere across time the echo of his shot still lingered, faint but steady, like a second heartbeat beneath history's noise. Maybe that's all heroism ever is, not grand gestures or loud victories, but quiet defiance in moments when the world demands obedience. On the 100th anniversary of the Helsinki Games, the International Olympic Committee commissioned a memorial to athletes who represented nations in conflict. The designers debated for months, statues, plaques, flame installations, until one artist proposed something simple. A single bronze bullet, suspended in glass, pointing downward, untouched by corrosion. Beneath it an inscription. To those who chose not to shoot. When the memorial was unveiled, a thin hush fell over the crowd. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then, softly, someone began to clap, slow, deliberate, as if honoring a sound they couldn't quite remember. The applause spread. The flame behind the memorial flickered, and for a moment, just long enough for the camera to capture, the reflection on the glass looked like a face, calm, weathered, and smiling faintly. No one noticed at first. But when the photo went viral days later, people began to wonder who it looked like. A soldier? A marksman? A ghost? No one could say. But somewhere, if history still keeps its promises, a man who once vanished into snow might have smiled again. Not from pride but from peace. Because in the end that was the only target that ever mattered. The one he hit without firing. Years drifted on, and the memorial in Helsinki became something the city didn't quite know how to classify. It wasn't patriotic and it wasn't tragic. It was quiet, almost too quiet for tourists who came looking for flags and dates and names. The plaque said nothing about nations. It simply stood there, the bullet and the light, two small things refusing to corrode. School groups came in the mornings and the guides told them the story the way they had learned it, half history, half rumor. A Soviet shooter, a missed shot, an impossible act of mercy. They never said his name, only that it happened somewhere during the games. The children listened politely as children do, but sometimes one or two lingered, staring at the suspended bullet as if it were speaking in a language they didn't yet know. One of them, a girl with dark hair and an athlete's posture, came back years later as part of the Finnish shooting team. She'd never forgotten that glass case. Before leaving for her first competition, she visited the memorial again. The bronze still glowed under the same light. She stood there for a long time, then whispered, "Thank you." She didn't know who she was thanking. Maybe no one did. She went on to compete, to win, to lose, to live. In every interview, when asked what inspired her, she never spoke of heroes or victory. She only said, "There was a man who chose differently once." The journalists always nodded politely, not understanding. But her words spread in small ways. They reached coaches, athletes, soldiers, people who understood that sometimes winning means nothing compared to the weight of a decision. Far away, in a Moscow archive that had been digitized and reopened to the public, and in turn scrolling through files stumbled upon a faded document titled Voronov, Mikhail Sergeyevich. It had no classification stamp. Most of it was blank. Only one line had been typed beneath the photograph. Disappeared, presumed at peace. The intern paused, printed it, and pinned it to a corkboard near his desk where he kept small things that didn't belong anywhere else. Ticket stubs, a photograph of his grandfather, a quote that read, "Truth needs no witness to be real." He never mentioned the file again. But sometimes, late at night, when the office was empty and snow hissed against the windows, he'd look at that faded photograph and imagine the man walking through a Finnish forest, finally unarmed, finally free. Time continued its quiet march. The Cold War turned into history books turned into data, and data turned into something people scrolled past without thinking. But in certain moments, when an athlete helps another up from the track, when two nations shake hands after decades of silence, there is always a trace of that invisible shot. People still argue about what matters most in sport: the record, the medal, the spectacle. Yet the games survive because, deep down, they are about the same fragile idea Mikhail carried with him, that even when the world is divided, we can choose to meet not as enemies but as competitors, and maybe, just maybe, as people. If anyone ever doubted that one small act could echo through time, they have only to stand before that glass case in Helsinki. The bullet still hangs there, light bending around it. On quiet days, when the crowds thin and the wind presses softly against the museum's walls, you can hear a faint sound, the air moving, or perhaps something else, a vibration caught between memory and mercy. It sounds, just for an instant, like a rifle's breath before the shot that never came. And in that sound, history holds its breath. Every few years, someone proposes replacing the memorial. They say it's too understated, that tourists want something grander, maybe a statue, a flame, a wall of names. But the city council always refuses. No one can quite explain why, but whenever the subject comes up, silence fills the room and someone finally says, "It's enough as it is." Because deep down, everyone feels it, the weight of that small, impossible choice. The idea that restraint can be louder than violence. That peace, when chosen deliberately, has a sound of its own. The memorial stayed the same. The bullet remained suspended in its glass coffin. The light above it never burned out. Every now and then, a visitor would swear that the light flickered when they approached, that the bullet seemed to shimmer faintly as if catching something unseen. Others said that if you stood there long enough, the glass would hum, like a note played on the edge of time. Most people dismissed it as imagination, but a few left with tears in their eyes, unable to say why. On the 150th anniversary of the 1952 Games, the International Olympic Committee held a small ceremony in Helsinki, a gathering meant to honor athletes of conscience. No television crews came. No world leaders attended. Just a handful of historians, athletes, and veterans, sitting in folding chairs beneath a cold Nordic sun. Among them was an old man, a former Finnish soldier, frail but sharp-eyed. When the moment of silence came, he leaned forward and whispered, "He would have hated all this." The woman beside him smiled softly. "Then why are you here?" He looked at the memorial, his voice a graveled whisper. "Because I saw him once," he said. On the range. The day after the shot. He wasn't competing, just standing there looking at the targets. I didn't know who he was. But when I saw his eyes, I knew he had already made peace with something the rest of us couldn't understand. He didn't speak again. The wind carried his words away the way it carries everything in the end. That night after the ceremony, the city fell quiet. The Olympic Stadium stood empty, its floodlights off, its fields silvered by moonlight. In the silence, the old echoes stirred, cheers from 1952, laughter, the sharp crack of a rifle that never hit its mark. And for a moment, if you were still enough, you could almost see him, a figure at the edge of the range, coat collar turned up, hands in his pockets, watching the stars as if aiming at them. He wasn't a ghost. He was what peace looks like when it learns to walk. Years later, a filmmaker decided to make a short film inspired by the legend. He called it The Man Who Missed on Purpose. He never mentioned countries or names, only the act itself. The film ended with a single shot fired into the sky, the sound echoing into silence. When it premiered at a small festival, the audience sat motionless for nearly a minute after the credits ended. No one clapped. No one spoke. Then slowly a man in the back stood up and said, "My father was a soldier. I wish he'd seen this." The filmmaker never made another movie. He said that story was enough. Now, when young shooters train for the Olympics, some coaches tell them a phrase before their final round. Remember Helsinki. They don't explain what it means. They don't have to. It's a code now, a whisper passed through generations. It means remember your humanity before your target. And maybe that's what Mikhail Voronov wanted all along. Not to be remembered as a man who disappeared, but as the idea that somewhere in every moment of violence, there's still a choice. The range, the rifle, the target, they all fade with time. But the silence he left behind endures. It's there between the heartbeat and the shot, between the inhale and the exhale, between war and what comes after. And when the next Olympic flame is lit, burning against a dark sky, that silence will be there too, not behind it but within it. Waiting, listening, remembering. Because once a man was told to fire. And instead he taught the world how not to. There are nights in Helsinki when fog rolls in from the sea and wraps the city in the kind of stillness that erases the present. On those nights, when the streets empty and the lamps hum against the cold, the Olympic Stadium looks almost exactly as it did in 1952. The same concrete curves, the same narrow windows, the same sense of waiting for something that will never happen again. Caretakers still walk the halls. They talk to each other about maintenance, schedules, small repairs, but some nights one of them will pause, turn toward the old shooting range and listen. They swear they can hear a sound there, a faint metallic breath, the quiet echo of a single cartridge being chambered. They shrug it off. Buildings remember things, that's all. It isn't superstition, it's history refusing to go quiet. A few years ago, during renovations, workers uncovered an old floor drain beneath one of the practice rooms. Inside was a small waterproof tin. Inside the tin was a folded piece of paper, brittle but legible. It wasn't a confession or a report, it was a message. If peace ever feels too quiet, listen harder. That silence is what the world sounds like when it's healing. The museum took it. Experts argued about authenticity. Was it Mikhail? A teammate? A journalist? No one could prove it, but no one could disprove it either. The words were mounted beside the bullet memorial, not as an artifact but as a question. People began to leave small things under the display case. Notes, medals, buttons from uniforms, empty shell casings turned into charms. It became a ritual no one organized. A way of acknowledging the space between the shot and the choice. In another part of the world, a class of students studying 20th century history watched a recording of that memorial ceremony. When the screen showed the suspended bullet, a boy raised his hand. "Why didn't he just defect?" he asked. The teacher smiled faintly. "Maybe he already did," she said. "Not to another country. To himself." It was a good answer. Maybe the only one. Decades pass, generations shift, but some stories refuse to be finished. The legend of the Soviet marksman survives not because people need another hero, but because they need proof that conscience can exist inside duty. That even in a century of orders and obedience, one person can still choose differently. If you walk through the old forests north of Helsinki where his trail once ended, you'll find traces of him. Not artifacts, just spaces that feel inhabited by memory. A ridge where the snow seems untouched no matter how many storms pass. A clearing where birds circle quietly instead of singing. The locals say it's just the wind playing tricks, but when they leave offerings, coins, bits of paper, matches, they do it with respect. Some truths never fade because they never needed to be shouted. They were whispered once and the world kept listening. When the games return to Helsinki someday, if they ever do, maybe someone will remember to visit that small corner of the museum first. They'll see the bullet, the letter, the light. Maybe they'll read the note behind the glass and understand that not all legacies are built from victory. And when the torch is carried through the city again, its flame will pass over the same streets Mikhail once walked, its reflection flashing in the windows of a place that once hosted both competition and conscience. The crowd will cheer, the music will swell, and somewhere beneath the roar, a quieter sound will linger, the steady heartbeat of a story that chose not to end. Because peace, when chosen, never really ends. It just waits for someone brave enough to keep carrying it. Sometimes, late at night, the city guard still circles the stadium grounds. The place is empty, locked, and silent, but every now and then he pauses by the range, keys jingling faintly at his belt. He's not sure why, habit maybe or respect, but he always looks toward the dark outline of the targets and nods once before moving on. There are lights in the stands, soft and dim, left on for safety. They cast long shadows across the field, and from a distance, they make the place look inhabited, as if the games are still happening somewhere out of sight. The guard once told a friend that he sometimes sees a shape near the range, a figure standing straight-backed, hands clasped behind him, watching the field. The friend laughed. "You've been reading too many ghost stories," he said. But the guard doesn't drink and he doesn't lie. "Maybe I have," he said quietly. Or maybe he never left. A journalist from America came one summer to write a feature on forgotten Olympic legends. She had read about the marksman in an old magazine, the way you find a rumor inside a rumor. She visited the museum, took notes, interviewed caretakers, and finally asked the curator, "Do you believe he existed?" The curator hesitated, then said, "Belief isn't the point. The games need him to have existed." The journalist asked why, and the curator smiled. "Because the Olympics are about what's best in us." But he reminds us that best doesn't always mean strongest. The article was never published. The editor said it was too somber, too uncertain. But the journalist kept her notes, and when she retired years later, she used a line from the story as the title of her memoir, The Man Who Missed. Somewhere in the archives of the Finnish Broadcasting Company is a recording of the 1952 games, grainy footage, black and white, the kind that stutters and jumps. On one of the reels, mislabeled and forgotten, there's a few seconds of film that no one can explain. A man in a Soviet uniform standing near the range, looking not at the camera but at the horizon. He doesn't move. He doesn't smile. He just stands there, the sun behind him. Then the film cuts. Technicians who have seen it say there's nothing unusual about it. Just a face, just a man. But one of them, an old projectionist, told his grandson that if you slow it down, you can see it, the exact moment the man breathes in, the light catching his eye, and for a single frame it looks like he's at peace. That reel has been copied, restored, digitized, archived again. The image circulates online now, part of 100 blogs about mysteries of the Olympics. People argue about it endlessly. Was it Mikhail? Another athlete? A trick of light? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the argument itself is the proof that he left something behind, something you can't measure or confirm, only feel. When young athletes visit Helsinki now, they're taken to the memorial before they train. The coach stands in front of the glass and says, "You all think you're here to prove something. Remember that some of the greatest things ever proved were never recorded." No one laughs. They just listen, and for a few moments the room is completely still. Because even if they don't know the details, they recognize the story. It's the one buried inside every person who's ever stood at the edge of action and hesitated, not from fear but from understanding. The world changes. The tools of war change. But the silence between conflict and choice remains the same. That silence has a name now, whispered in locker rooms and shooting ranges and late-night interviews. It's called the Voronov pause. A journalist coined it by accident while covering a match. The athlete took a Voronov pause, he said, describing a moment of calm focus before a perfect shot. The term spread quietly the way all real things do. Now it means more than concentration, it means conscience. The stillness before decision. The respect before action. Some call it superstition. Some call it luck. But to those who understand, it's remembrance. And maybe that's all the world needs to keep his story alive. Not monuments or medals, but moments. Small pauses in which people, whether soldiers or athletes or strangers on the street, take one breath longer than necessary and think. Because that single breath, just one, can be the difference between repetition and redemption. That was his gift. And the world, though it forgets names, never quite forgets gifts. So when the next games begin, when the flame rises again and the music swells and the nations march side by side, look closely at the faces in the crowd. Somewhere in that ocean of color and noise, someone will close their eyes just for a heartbeat before they act. That's where he lives now. Not in the past. Not in myth. But in the pause between what we can do and what we should.